Assalamu alaikum, everybody. So we're going to start, inshallah, and today's hadith, as you could see, is the 14th hadith or the 15th hadith from the Al-Arba'in al-Nawawiyya, and it actually relates to a number of issues. Last week I got sick and I couldn't continue, but hopefully, inshallah, today I won't get sick and I'll be able to continue the hadith. So the hadith reads, عن أبي هريرة رضي الله عنه أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال من كان يؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر فليقل خيرا أو ليصمت ومن كان يؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر فليكرم جاره ومن كان يؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر فليكرم ضيفه رواه البخاري ومسلم. I'm going to read the hadith again just so that we can get the hang of reading it and understanding the words again. عن أبي هريرة رضي الله عنه أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال من كان يؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر فليقل خيرا أو ليصمت ومن كان يؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر فليكرم جاره ومن كان يؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر فليكرم ضيفه رواه البخاري ومسلم. Now, a number of things that we learn from this hadith, and when we look at the first segment of it, which is من كان يؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر, that it was actually repeated several times, 3 times here, من كان يؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر. So why is it that a lot of the different regulations in Islam actually condition 2 things? من كان يؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر. So الإيمان بالله سبحانه وتعالى and الإيمان بالآخر. الإيمان بالله as the one that made life in the beginning. Now, if you believe that life was made for a purpose, then therefore you're going to act upon that purpose in order to gain the akhirah. So to believe in al-Iman billah, to believe in Allah and Judgment Day, would actually mean that you believe in the foundation of life, in what even started life, and even for the reason that life had actually begun. And in this situation, of course, our actions. So the Prophet ﷺ very frequently says, "Man kana yu'minu billahi wal yawmil akhir," that if you believe in Allah and you believe in Judgment Day. Al-Akhir means in the last day. And فَلْيَقُلْ خَيْرًا أَوْ لِيَصْمُتْ, so that they should say what is good or stay silent. فَلْيَقُلْ خَيْرًا أَوْ لِيَصْمُتْ, that they should say what is good or stay silent. Now, saying what is good would actually tell us that فَلْيَقُلْ. Now here, the letter فَلْيَقُلْ. So this is telling us that if you have faith in these 2 sides, then number 1, فَلْيَقُلْ, then you should only say what is good or stay silent. When we look at فَلْيَقُلْ خَيْرًا, would mean that for 2 things, فَلْيَقُلْ خَيْرًا. There is خير لذاته and there is خير لغير ذاته. So خير لذاته, meaning that the خير, the words themselves, are actually good. So what does it mean that the word itself is good? The word itself is good, meaning that it's dhikr, meaning that it's that it's saying good things. So what does saying bad things look like? Because the opposite of khair in here, when we're talking about the word itself would mean that the opposite of the al-qawl al-salih is mentioned in another hadith where the Prophet ﷺ actually says, لَيْسَ الْمُؤْمِنْ بِالطَّعَانِ وَلَا اللَّعَانِ وَلَا الْفَاحِشْ وَلَا الْبَذِيء وَلَا الْفَاحِشْ وَلَا الْبَذِيء. Now this explains وَلَا الْبَذِيء. This explains a lot to us when we speak about فَلْيَقُلْ خَيْرًا. Well, you can't know what is good unless you know what is bad. So in another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ explained to us what is bad, or we can call it evil talk, or what is considered as lahu. Lahu is 2 types. We're going to talk about that in just a bit. So number one type of evil talk is a ta'an. A ta'an in where the person is talking or constantly speaking about people's mistakes, people's sins, people's or any comment that a person would hate to hear you saying about them. The comment could be true and could be false. So it could be true where indeed that person is cheap, or indeed that person is probably too proud, or whatever. So that would be still considered part of the opposite of qawl al-khair. The other side, which is even if it is not true, when the Sahaba asked the Prophet ﷺ, what if it is true? He said, then you, in that situation, then you have really committed what is called ghaiba, that you talked about this person in something that they would hate you to say about them. Now, the other type is that if it is not true, that person, for example, you called that person cheap, or you called that person ignorant, even though they actually are educated, for example, then in that situation you had committed buhtan. Buhtan would mean that you had committed blasphemy. So when we speak about itta'an meaning that the person is constantly busy speaking about criticizing others, constantly speaking about others' mistakes, and not working on correcting their own mistakes. And this is very common in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually teaching us what are the methods in order to help us grow in our spirituality. It starts with the person actually fixing or doing that verbal therapy, that oral therapy, to make sure that what they are saying is actually reflecting that what is on the inside. What is in their heart is that they are focused on their own criticism, on their own sins, and not other people's sins. So here, when we're talking about لَيْسَ الْمُؤْمِنْ بِالطَّعَانِ, meaning that they're not looking at other people's sins, but instead they're actually looking at their own sins. وَلَا اللَّعَانِ, which is the person that's constantly damning things. The person that's constantly damning things or using illicit language, that is al-la'an, constantly complaining about the situation, or probably complaining about their life, or probably complaining about others, or cursing the situation, cursing the things around them, cursing the people around them. That is al-la'an. So meaning that the opposite of qawl al-khair is either ta'an or al-la'an or al-fahish, and they can be wala al-fahish wala al-badhi'. What is al-fahish? Al-fahish is the person that describes the hidden things, the private things, in very illicit or very let's call it very clear words, very terms that are too open. So instead of saying that they wanted to use the bathroom, they might use words to describe what they're actually going to do. So this would be fush. Same thing if we're talking about a wife and a husband and a wife, and they're describing what they're doing, or describing probably some private moments. That would be fush. Il-badha'a would more be where using profanity, using language with very illicit language, in where they're describing also hidden things, but al-fuhsh more relates to personal private issues. But al-badha'a is more using terms that are supposed to be vague by adab, by discipline, and talking about it in clear and obvious terms. The other part, ليس المؤمن بالطاعان ولا اللعان ولا الفاحش ولا البذيء. In another ayah where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described the mu'mineen that they don't engage in اللغو والذين هم عن اللغو معرضون, that they stay away from اللغو. Now the word لغو, I'm going to comment on this, because the word لغو just simply means different sounds, but it can also mean trivial talk. So laghu وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ عَنِ اللَّغْوِ مُعْرِضُونَ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described them, that the believers abstain from trivial talk. To abstain from trivial talk, the type of trivial talk would mean either the word itself is trivial, or the intention or what it might lead to is probably harming. So it can go into a direction where it is harming others, whether intentionally harming others or whether it may lead to harming others. That would be considered as shar لغير ذاته, where it will affect on the long run, or that it will kind of like, those games where you hit one ball, but in fact it's actually hitting more than one ball, and if eventually it will lead to different targets. And that's the same way in where when we're talking about فَلْيَقُلْ خَيْرًا, where the person is actually speaking in khayr, in terms of the word itself, or in terms of what it might lead to. أَوْ لِيَصْمُتْ, or that they shall stay silent, Now, a very important thing, especially when we're talking about, husband and wife relations, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had actually praised فَالصَّالِحَاتُ قَانِتَاتٌ حَافِظَاتٌ لِلْغَيْبِ حَافِظَاتٌ لِلْغَيْبِ. The word says حَافِظَاتٌ لِلْغَيْبِ بِمَا حَفِظَ اللَّهِ. Now here حَافِظَاتٌ لِلْغَيْبِ, because the context is speaking about husband and wife relations, حَافِظَاتٌ لِلْغَيْبِ would mean that it is praising the women that preserve the relationship between her and her husband, or even what happens at home. In order to preserve this home. So she's not sharing it with every single person, or even, and this happens very often, in where we're always encouraged to speak about what we feel, and we're always encouraged to speak about in a way of ventilation, to ventilate in a way to get it out of our system rather than keep it inside. But the Quran actually does the opposite, in where it tells you that you're supposed to be hafiz lil ghaib, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually praised the prophet when he said, innama ashku bathi wa huzni ila Allah, that I complain my bath and my huzn. And the difference between the bath and the huzn, in where when you have al-bath, that is a direct result of that sorrow that you went through. You went through a trauma. There was a direct result. There was a direct relationship between the trauma and probably the anxiety that you're going through. But the huzn, it isn't directly related with the trauma, but it was on the side. But it all eventually crumbled up, and it affected you, and it affected your psychology on the inside. So you complain to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فَلْيَقُلْ خَيْرًا أَوْ لِيَصْمُتْ. فَلْيَقُلْ خَيْرًا أَوْ لِيَصْمُتْ. Now, speaking of what is khayr, it is extremely important to keep in mind that samt in Islam is actually a form of spiritual therapy. And of course we remember when Sayyida Maryam, when she said, إِنِّي نَذَرْتُ لِلرَّحْمَنِ صَوْمًا فَلَنْ أُكَلِّمَ الْيَوْمَ إِنْسِيًّا. When Sayyida Maryam actually said إِنِّي نَذَرْتُ, that she had made an oath, لِلرَّحْمَنِ صَوْمًا, that she would abstain. Now the word صَوْم in this ayah does not mean fasting from eating and drinking, but it means fasting from speaking. That she is abstaining from any type of an oral conversation whatsoever. فَلَنْ أُكَلِّمَ الْيَوْمَ إِنْسِيًّا is a clarification to what practice of siyam that she was doing, which is to abstain from any type of a verbal conversation. And that's why when they asked her, So what is this in between your hands? فَأَشَارَتْ إِلَيْهِ. She just pointed at it because she had made the oath that she would not speak to anyone. Now this type in Islam, this type of fasting from talking is actually muharram in Sharia al-Islam, but in the Islamic Sharia is actually haram unless the person is fasting from illicit talk or the talk that is talking about other people. Now that type of talk, it is obligatory to fast from that talk, but it is haram to fast from other good talk. So from other good talk, you have to engage in other good talk, such as one, ordering for what is good and forbidding what is evil. What does ordering for what is good and forbidding what is evil? So to order for what is good, الأمر بالمعروف, الأمر بالمعروف, and النهي عن المنكر. There are a number of different adab that relate to al-amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy an munkar. Number one is that إنما أدعو الله على بصيرة أنا ومن اتبعني. That the person, when they would do the da'wah, that they would have the ilm for it. Not necessarily be scholars per se, but they would have the ilm in order to know that this really is haram, or at least when they actually discuss this ma'ruf or discuss what is good, that they have the ilm in order to make sure that what the person is really doing is really halal or haram, and not necessarily their own perspective, which may actually tahtamil, meaning that it can have differences of opinions between scholars on that matter. So in al-amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar requires إنما أدعو الله على بصيرة, على بصيرة, that there has to be basira, deep insight, deep ilm, and that's the same thing with every single person that's doing the da'wah. But does that mean if I am not practicing that? Let's say the person is doing da'wah, but they know that they have their shortcomings and they too don't always practice that. Does that mean that they should stop? It doesn't mean that they should stop. It is, inshallah, hopefully something that will encourage them to rethink and to review themselves into doing what is good. So do an order for what is good, even if you yourself don't practice it. Hopefully, inshallah, you will realize that shortcoming, and you will, inshallah, start reviewing yourself, because you don't want to be part of those that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had described the munafiqeen, that they will say what they don't do. That they will say what they don't do. So in that situation, al-amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy an al-munkar requires al-ilm, and requires, of course, is sabr. Now, when we're looking at sabr, this hadith is actually training us in sabr as well. In sabr, in sabr in our speech, in where we say what is good and we make sabr. We are patient in having that samt. It is very hard if you have the urge to say something to actually keep it inside, because your urge will many times go on the surface and make you feel like, I just need to say it. I just need to say it. Now, that's why samt is one way in teaching us how to have sabr. Sabr goes into two directions. Sabr an il-ma'asi, on haram things, abstaining from it, from sins, from anything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not want you to do, and sabr ala ta'a, and having sabr ala ta'a. Sabr ala ta'a, meaning the patience to actually perform what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually asking us to do, which is obedience here. What is sabr? Sabr requires a number of things. Sabr, you may have different inclinations. Those inclinations that you would get on the inside usually, act as a form of potential, as a form of energy that wants to come out. It could be anger energy. It could be pain energy. It could be energy in where you just want to share something. It could be hunger. All those different inclinations, they're basically just different potentials, whether negative or positive potentials, just different types of energies. It could be a good energy, or it could be different powers, and it makes you want to do certain things. So in this situation, the first thing that sabr, in order for you to do that sabr, is really control those inclinations, whether they are good or whether they are bad. So controlling controlling those inclinations from going outside the boundary. And this is the point. The whole point is really outside the boundary. So in order to have the sabr, you're doing what is called habs. Habs is basically imprisonment. All those different inclinations, you're putting them inside the boundary by keeping it within the boundary that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had considered as the boundary in how you can express your feelings or perform a certain behavior or do a certain behavior to let those inclinations out of your systems. So that's why the sabr cannot be outside of الصبر عن المعصية والصبر في الطاعة. الصبر from performing or doing a certain sin, and الصبر to perform a certain obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The other part, when we're talking about الصبر, that requires العزيمة. العزيمة. What is العزيمة? العزيمة would be the determination. The stronger you are in your sabr, that's when you will have a stronger determination to not do what that haram thing is, in where you are determined, no matter how hard and how strong your inclinations grew in you, you are determined not to do that haram thing, or at least determined to do the right thing. But sabr and azima requires a very important thing, which is consistency. So here the Prophet ﷺ, that's why he said فَلْيَقُلْ خَيْرًا أَوْ لِيَصْمُتْ فَلْيَقُلْ خَيْرًا أَوْ لِيَصْمُتْ, as this part, which is whoever believes in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But this is not saying that the person is a disbeliever, because this would be a sin if they had said the haram things. But this is takmila. This is like their iman would not be kamil, would not be complete unless they perform such behaviors. And having that being said, that iman is related to behavior and is not necessarily inside the heart alone. A real iman would not only be in the heart, but would actually be expressed in a specific behavior, in different behaviors, whether that is in their wording, in how they vocalize their needs, or they talk about others, or how they engage in that social dynamic, and how they put that type of practice in place. Now, in another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ actually told Mu'adh, when he asked, well, are people going to be held accountable for what they have said? And the Prophet ﷺ said that, and explained it to Mu'adh, that most people actually enter hellfire because of what their tongues have said. In other words, when we're talking about spiritual therapy, a lot of the spiritual therapy actually starts by holding your urge to speak. Holding your urge from speaking, whether about certain topics or engaging to speak about people, in where once you learn how to do that therapy, that is when you're going to be able to find more timing to say what is right, and you're going to find more timing to do what is haqq, and eventually you're going to find more timing to do the dhikr. And of course, when we speak about doing dhikr, we're talking about here the oral dhikr, in where the person is engaged in doing the connection between them and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, rather than focusing on the connection between them and the people. You're now fixing the connection from it being the dynamic being between you and people to being between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is when you will enhance a spiritual relationship where it will be Rabbaniyya. Well, it will be Rabbaniyya, meaning, well, it will be just like the malaika, in where their salah, their tasbih, their dhikr is constantly in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So once you take away all the negative speech, that's the only time when your tongue will be ready and prepared to say what is haqq, and the good speech that you would be needing. And that's That's exactly what in another hadith where the Prophet ﷺ actually explained explained for al-mu'min that when the Prophet ﷺ was asked أي ذنب أعظم, he said أن تجعل الله لدا وهو خلقك. إن قيل ثم أي, قال أن تقتل ولدك مخافة أن يطعم معك. And then he said that the final part, which is أن تزني حليلة جارك, that there are certain actions without you realizing what will get you into the dynamics of where you're engaging in other things other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or you're talking about finances, or you're talking about in those different areas. In the end, it will affect what your focus is on. So by changing the topics, the perspective, the angle in what you're talking about, you'll be able to then engage and take the first step to spiritual therapy. In Islam, by the way, it's really important to mention, can we actually make the oath just like Sayyidah Maryam, and actually not speak at all, and only say dhikr? Now, here's one thing, is that Sharia is not part of Shari'at al-Islam. And to actually take that as an evidence that yes, I want to engage in that, we could see that in other hadith that the Prophet ﷺ clarified, in other hadith that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not in need of their silence, and that they cannot perform what also in the Jahiliyyah what they used to do, which is not speak after Isha. But the Prophet ﷺ clarified that it should be on good terms, it should be in good ways, but it doesn't mean to totally abstain from any type of speaking. Now, in one of the ahadith, in one of the marasil, actually, so that would be an athar, that he had actually mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ mentioned, علامة الطهر أن يكون قلب العبد عندي متعلقا، فإذا كان كذلك لم ينسني على حال، وإذا كان كذلك مننت عليه بالاشتغال بي كي لا ينساني، فإذا نسيني حركت قلبه، فإن تكلم لي، وإن سكت لي، فذلك الذي تأتيه المعونة من عندي. Let me translate this one. That the Prophet ﷺ, this hadith is what a mursal, which means that a large portion of the chain of narration was not mentioned, but he had mentioned فيما يرويه عن ربه, meaning that this is a hadith Qudsi, that he had said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that the sign علامة الطهر, that the sign of true purification, أن يكون قلب العبد عندي متعلقا, that the servant's heart would be connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It would be always linked with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If it was so, then they would not forget me at any circumstance. And if they are like that, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would bless them in working and doing what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders them to do, so they would not forget Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because if they فَإِذَا نَسِيَنِي, and if they forget Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would حركت قلبه, meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would somehow shake his heart, and then he will speak for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when he's quiet, they will be quiet because they're pondering on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he said those are the people that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give the assistance to from him directly. This starts from being silent. The art of silence, the art of talking, and the art of silence are totally connected with the art and the beginning of spiritual therapy. وَمَنْ كَانَ يُؤْمِنُ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ فَلْيُكْرِمْ جَارَهُ. And whoever believes in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then let them be فَلْيُكْرِمْ جَارَهُ, let them be hospitable to their neighbors. In another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ actually the Prophet ﷺ actually said that um, that what does it mean to be hospitable to the neighbor? And he actually said that if in istaqradaka aqradta, that if he had asked you to borrow something, you would give him to borrow, which is where the ayah actually says, أرأيت الذي يكذب بالدين فذلك الذي يدع اليتيم ولا يحض على طعام المسكين فويل للمصلين الذين هم عن صلاتهم ساهون الذين هم يراءون ويمنعون الماعون. Those that forbid, those that prevent any type of utensil sharing. Now, the utensil is not really the utensil itself alone in where you're sharing, but those that cut all the different ties in that social connection, all those social connections, by not having anything shared, even if that meant a utensil. So when we're talking about the hadith, in istaqaradaka aqradta, meaning when he would ask to borrow something, you would let him borrow it. This is for the neighbor. And وَإِنِ اسْتَعَانَكَ أَعَنْتَهُ, that when he would ask for any type of help, you would give him the help. وَإِنْ مَرِضَ عُدْتَهُ, that when they would get sick, you would visit them. And when they need, وَإِنْ احْتَاجَ أَعْطَيْتَهُ, and when they need something, you would give them and share with them. وَإِنْ افْتَقَرَ عُدْتَ إِلَيْهِ, and when they feel that they need somebody to be next to them, that you would be there to give them the support. وَأَصَابَهُ خَيْرٌ هَنَّيْتَهُ, and when they would have something good happen to them, you would be there to celebrate with them and congratulate them for the good thing that's happening. وَإِنْ أَصَابَتْهُ مُصِيبَةٌ عَزَّيْتَهُ, and when somebody dies for them or they lose a loved one, you would actually be there to give them the support. وَإِذَا مَاتَ اتَّبَعْتَ جَنَازَتَهُ, and when they die, you follow in their جنازة, in their funeral. ولا تستطيل عليه البناء بالبناء فتحجب عنه الرياح إلا بإذنه, and that you would not build something like a wall and then probably prevent the airflow from going towards him. ولا تؤذيه بريح قدرك إلا أن تغرف له منها, and that you would not تؤذيه, it's like you don't harm them by بريح قدرك, meaning you would, let's say, cook a meal and they would probably want some of that meal, إلا أن تغرف له منها, but you would scoop for them a portion of it to share it with them. وإن اشتريت فاكهة فاهدي له, and when you actually buy any فاكهة, any fruit or vegetables or food, you would actually gift him from it as well. وإن لم تفعل فأدخلها سرا, and if you can't do it, they're not accepting, just without making them feel that their honor was in any way hurt, you would enter it and give it to them in a secret, or in secret, or in a hidden way. ولا تخرج بها ولدك ليغيظ بها ولده, and you don't let your child go out bragging about what they have, because you don't want to harm their children if they cannot afford it. And in this hadith, although this hadith is this hadith is isnad wahi, but we can learn some of the sides, some of the angles in where, what does it mean to be good to the neighbor? Now that's why when we're talking about being good to the neighbor, whether that neighbor was Muslim or whether that neighbor was not Muslim, it's really important to remember that there are a number of things that we have to consider in the way we deal with the people around us. When we deal with the people around us, we must always consider a number of different issues. I'm going to share another slide, if you may. And when we speak about, sorry about that, sometimes when you have three screens in front of you, sometimes it's hard to focus on which screen are we talking about. Sorry about that. Looks like all right. So when we speak about, okay, hold on, sorry, I'm trying to share the other screen. Like I said, sometimes when you have three screens in front of you and then all these different tabs, you're confused. When we look at the different angles in dealing with the people around us, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَاعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ وَلَا تُشْرِكُوا بِهِ شَيْئًا وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا وَبِذِي الْقُرْبَى وَالْيَتَامَى وَالْمَسَاكِينِ والجار ذي القربى والجار الجنب والصاحب بالجنب وابن السبيل وما ملكت أيمانكم إن الله لا يحب من كان مختالا فخورا. When we look at these different corners, you could see that there are certain classifications here in where it's talking about حقوق الله and حقوق العباد. But even when we're talking about حقوق العباد, they're not at the same level, because when we're speaking about حقوق العباد, we're actually classifying them with one. It starts out with بالوالدين, it starts out with the parents, and then it goes بذي القربى. Then it goes for the relatives meaning the ones that you have blood connections with them. What does it mean to have that responsibility, that shared responsibility, that right that you have to perform? So in other words, your sister or your brother does not have equal rights as your friend. Your friend, you may have a lot of commonality. You may share a lot of different common grounds with them. They may seem nicer to you, but Islamically, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told you that parents come first in considering their rights, and then the second part, which is the family, the relatives. Now the relatives, in where the more you share with that particular relative from, let's say, the biological sister or brother that you share mother and father with, is not the very same relationship that you share with, for example, a sister or a brother that you only share father with, or that you share mother with. But in the end is that لا تدري أيهم أقرب لكم نفعا. You don't know who's going to be the best to you. So in that situation, when we're talking about having that ihsan, al-ihsan for al-walidain is on the top of that ihsan, in where it requires that even if they are to transgress the limits with you, you still have to maintain that respect. Now we go for bidil qurba. How do we deal with bidil qurba? How do we deal with the relationship when we're talking about dhil qurba? There's a number of things. In the other slide, inna Allah ya'muru bil adli wal ihsan, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders for al adl wal ihsan. There is, the limit is al adl. Al-ihsan is an increase in where you're giving, although that person might have transgressed the limit with you, but you are giving extra. This is al-ihsan. For al-adl is where, we've got boundaries. We share limits in how we would perform what is fair. You visit me, I visit you. You respect me, I respect you. But then al-ihsan is a different level, that the person might not have been doing that justful duties, may not have been very just, but then you decided to go for al-ihsan. You decided to give in even more. This is a higher level. Now that's why that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, you could see, inna Allah ya'muru bil adli wal ihsan, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders for justice and also al-ihsan, a higher level. And from that base, then you would deal with إِيتَاءِ ذِي الْقُرْبَى. إِيتَاء ذِي الْقُرْبَى, where you're coming closer to the الْقُرْبَى, coming closer to the relatives. You're giving the relatives, you're Yes, they might have transgressed the limits with you, but you still have to be patient because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually telling you to go farther than just al-adl, to go farther than just justice in where you did this to me and I did this to you, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is ordering you to go higher in principle, in where you're trying to get to the level of where you are part of al-muhsineen and not necessarily looking at the limit. And at the same time, ينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي. When we're dealing with people, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us وَيَنْهَى عَنِ الْفَحْشَاءِ, and where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbids الفحشاء. الفحشاء, why? It often happens when we're talking about relatives. And when we're talking about relatives, it can happen where we could feel hurt and we can transgress the limit and actually engage in fahsha and engage in revealing their privacies. You might know something about your sister or your brother that other people might not know. To speak about them and say, you know, you might see them good, but I know them as a brother or a sister. They're actually evil people. I know what's on the inside. This is what they did, and start sharing their privacies. This is fahsha. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala let you, and because you are a qarib, because you are a relative, you were able to see what others couldn't see. But that doesn't mean you go sharing their privacies. Just like you don't share your husband's privacies, you also don't share al-qurba's privacies. They may have ill manners, they may have illicit things that they have done, they may have gone wrong on certain things, but here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you وَيَنْهَى عَنِ الْفَحْشَاءِ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbids al-fahsha, and you don't say it. وَالْمُنْكَرِ, what is al-munkar? Al-munkar is any evil doing relating to the relatives, or even, we're going to see it later on, or even al-jar, or even the relatives. Yanha, the difference between al-fahsha wal-munkar, al-fahsha, we mentioned it before, you're revealing the private things and revealing it to the public, and al-munkar, in where you're transgressing your limits. Al-baghi is oppressing. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us how we keep that in place, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says لا يسخر قوم من قوم عسى أن يكونوا خيرا منهم. لا يسخر. So the first part, لا يسخر, let me just write it down. لا يسخر قوم من قوم. Let there not be any group of people يسخر, to ridicule any other group of people or any part of that, any part of any group or any person. لا يسخر قوم من قوم عسى أن يكونوا خيرا منهم. That because they may even be better than them. ولا نساء من نساء عسى أن يكون خيرا منهم. And of course, in the ayah it continues that a person is supposed to abstain from dhann. What is a dhann? A dhann is considered the speculation, in where a dhann in itself is behind most of the problems. 90% of the problems actually come from dhann, doubt, skepticism. Let me use another word, interpreting other people's motives. When you would interpret somebody's motive based on your perspective, based on your perception, it may not actually be true. And that comes in when we're looking at the hadith that we were doing, that hadith, in where من كان يؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر فليقل خيرا أو ليصمت, in where let them say what is khayr, because dhann in this ayah is actually telling us that dhann and doubt, and you putting your own interpretation to how you want to interpret somebody's motives, is one main evil thing, and it definitely is. وَاجْتَنِبُوا كَثِيرًا مِنَ الظَّنِّ إِنَّ بَعْضَ الظَّنِّ إِثْمٌ, that some dhann is actually ithm. Some of it is actually sin in itself, and this is the result. And this is, the beginning of most of al-baghi. Most of al-baghi and most of al-fahsha wal munkar, most of those sides in where different transgressing in the beginning, you will reveal certain private things that they had done, wrong things, but then you will give yourself the justification why it is okay. It is okay to transgress the limit with them, and then without you realizing, you'll go farther and actually fall in oppression and fall in baghi. You could see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us exactly how transgressing the limit with the relatives or even the others around us actually goes little by little in where we may not realize it. And here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually telling us that, you know what, stay away from any foundation of that, because in the end, without you realizing, it will affect you. And here in another ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually says, وَإِذْ أَخَذْنَا مِيثَاقَ بَنِي إِسْرَائِيلَ لَا تَعْبُدُونَ إِلَّا اللَّهَ وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا وَذِي الْقُرْبَى وَالْيَتَامَى وَالْمَسَاكِينِ وَقُولُوا لِلنَّاسِ حُسْنًا وَأَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةَ. Look at that hadith, the ayah, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and we took it upon the children of Israel that number one, لا تعبدون إلا الله, you only worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you act or you deal kindly with your parents and your relatives and the orphans and the masakin. And this is really important. Look at the level here in where before you give donations to the poor people and those that are needy and the homeless and etc., you actually should consider your parents first. First Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then your parents, then your relatives. In other words, giving your relatives the donation or probably the support or maybe the assistance that they need actually comes before assisting other people that are not even related to you. It starts with fixing the relationship between you and your family members. وَقُولُوا لِلنَّاسِ حُسْنًا, and tell people good things. In other words, in order to قُولُوا لِلنَّاسِ حُسْنًا, because it can happen that people will say, well, you know, the people around me, my relatives, you can find lots of harm. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, the base to it, in order to fix that relationship, قُولُوا لِلنَّاسِ حُسْنًا, say good things to people, and that will correct the relationship between you and all. And guess what? Notice here that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually says, وَأَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةِ, after telling you that this is the foundation when we're talking about the relationship between people. There it starts. قُولُوا لِلنَّاسِ حُسْنًا, fix the relationship between you, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, your parents, your relatives, and the rest of the people around you, even those that are needy. And the same thing, oftentimes it is so easy to be good and kind to distant people because they don't know us. It is so easy to put a mask on when we're dealing with people that are distant from us. But when we're dealing with relatives, they usually know our illnesses. They usually know our shortcomings. So that's why they would usually be hardest to deal with, because they know that we're not perfect. They know we're not perfect, and that's why the relatives, the closest relatives, are the ones to many times transgress the limit with you, to dishonor you, because they know really who you are. And that's why it gets harder. The closer the relative, the harder it gets. The farther the person, the easier it gets. But that's why you need that sabr. And they're the most ones to help you realize your shortcomings. They're the most ones to help you realize the shortcomings, because they're the bravest and the courageous to tell you your shortcomings, because all that haiba, all that honor that you had and that you have in public, they know your weaknesses. You don't have that same honor when you're actually talking with close relatives. So have the sabr, have the sabr, and even listen to those that share their shortcomings with you, because that is your way to help you realize, when you go wrong, to help you realize what you need to correct. Going back to the hadith, وَمَنْ كَانَ يُؤْمِنُ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ فَلْيُكْرِمْ جَارَهُ. Let them be hospitable to their neighbors. When we speak about neighbors, remember, we're talking about different levels. So here, فَلْيَقُلْ خَيْرًا أَوْ لِيَصْمُتْ is in general. This is a general adab, but there's another adab in where, yes, it starts with that oral therapy. You learn the art of silence to help you learn and grow in your iman in order to engage in dhikr. But even when we're talking about the people around you, this is telling you فَلْيُكْرِمْ جَارَهُ. This is telling you فَلْيُكْرِمْ جَارَهُ, but that is because other ayat, because other ayat have actually told you and clarified to you about dhil qurba wal yatama. So before we talk about فَلْيُكْرِمْ جَارَهُ, it was very important for us to speak about the different orders of the dynamics of the people around us, in where who comes even before the neighbor is actually your close relative, and then so forth. And then فَلْيُكْرِمْ جَارَهُ, where transgressing the limit with a neighbor is even a bigger sin than transgressing the limit with somebody else. The same thing, transgressing the limit with your brother or your sister or your family is actually a bigger transgression than transgressing with farther distant people. It would probably be normal, maybe at times, where somebody might say Salamu alaikum and you probably didn't hear it. But if your family member tells you Salamu alaikum and you insist that, no, I heard what they said, but I still don't want to respond because I'm angry, that's a bigger transgression right there. فَلْيُكْرِمْ جَارَهُ. And when we're talking about the daif, when we're talking about guests, the al-ikram al-jar, or being hospitable, actually goes back to al-urf, which is the tradition. The tradition, probably giving them water first, or probably giving them juice first, or probably, maybe showing them to the kitchen if that's your culture. That's left for al-urf to decide and determine what is considered as ikram al-dayf, what is considered as being hospitable to the neighbor. But we know the hadith where Jibril actually said that or Jibril alayhi salam was telling the Prophet ﷺ about al-jar, to the point that the Prophet ﷺ said, I felt that he was going to be the person to inherit from him. And when we're talking about ikram al-dayf, ikram al-jar, we're looking at being hospitable and taking care of the neighbor next to us. And that would mean from one neighbor to another, in where we're considering al-jar dhil qurba, the first jar. And you could see in the other, I'm going to bring about the other slide, and we're almost done with today's lesson, so just bear with me. But I want to show you this slide. You could see in this where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَاعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ وَلَا تُشْرِكُوا بِهِ شَيْئًا وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا وَبِذِي الْقُرْبَى وَالْيَتَامَى وَالْمَسَاكِينِ وَالْجَارِ ذِي الْقُرْبَى وَالْجَارِ الْجُنُبِ وَالصَّاحِبِ بِالْجَنبِ وَابْنِ السَّبِيلِ وَمَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُحِبُّ مَنْ كَانَ مُخْتَالًا فَخُورًا. I want you to look at this ayah closely here, in where, again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is putting those categories in where, how, and what the circle of the people around us look like. So here we are right there. The first circle that you want to maintain is your parents, bil walidain. The second circle is dhil qurba, And here's the second circle, the third and fourth circle, اليتامى, the orphans, and then المساكين, and then الجار. So now we're looking at a number of circles that we have to keep intact right here. And then الجار الجنب, and الصاحب بالجنب وابن السبيل. Now we're looking at those different areas, and where it looks like here's the nucleus right there, and then the first person you want to consider is your parents. But then when it comes to الجار, it's telling you about the neighbor. The first neighbor is the first and the most important neighbor, again emphasizing dhil qurba, the neighbor that is your relative. The relative neighbor. Could your sister might be your neighbor, or your brother. Oftentimes when the family builds a house, then they grow, and your family member becomes your immediate family member. Sometimes maybe the first neighbor next to you. And الجار الجنوب, where it's the other farther neighbor, and then the next one to that neighbor. Now, when we're looking at those boundaries, it's very important to even teach it to themselves and teach it to our children, to learn that at home, it actually starts. This is where you start to learn how to deal with the people around you. If you don't know how to deal with the people around you at home, if you're constantly fighting with your brother and sister at home, do you think you're going to have good relations with the people outside? If you failed at home, did you expect that you were going to be successful in dealing with the people outside of your home? It starts from here. And here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is teaching us in that ayah that it starts from home, in where you start your relationship from bil walidain. Do you know how to treat your family member? Do you know how to treat your parents? Do you know how to be humble? You learn how to be humble first by learning the art of silence and the art of speaking. The art of silence and the art of speaking, in where you know when to ask a question, you know how to ask, and you know how to watch your vocal cords, and you know how to understand the implications of your words in the long run. And when you deal فَلْيُكْرِمْ جَارَهُ, that you understand that not only is it the words, but it is also, when you are humble, to share. Just as you share with your neighbors, you also share the kindness. You give the support to your neighbors, and of course neighbors, relatives, their relative neighbors, and the neighbors after that, and the ones next to it, in order to maintain good relations within those circles of life. من كان يؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر فليكرم ضيفه. And for those who believes in Allah and Judgment Day, let them have that karam. Let them be hospitable to their guests. Let them be hospitable to their guests, in where not only are you maintaining your words, but even with your things, with your items, you're actually sharing it. And even when they go inside your home, you are being very hospitable, meaning kind, because al-ikram or al-karam is not only in sharing, but it is also in keeping any harm away from the person, any harm away, whether in their security, in how they may feel insecure because of that matter, or probably in their wealth. You're preserving their property, or you're preserving their ird, you're preserving their chastity, in where you're not sharing their private situation. If that neighbor is constantly in fights with their wife, you're not sharing it to the others. And that's why when we're talking about ikram al-dayf or al-ikram al-jar, it actually means al-ikram haram in their deen, in their nafs. You're ordering for what is good and forbidding what is evil. You're protecting their life and what maintains their life. You're preserving even the area in making them feel safe and making them feel that they're growing even on their mental health and their education, and even in their ird. You're preserving their chastity, you're securing it. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ actually said that if one were to commit 10 times zina outside of other women, it would be a lot easier than somebody committing zina with their neighbor, because it is going to be spreading mistrust between the communities. So here, preserving their chastity and preserving their honor and preserving their reputation, where you don't share it with others, and also preserving their wealth, where stealing from a neighbor is actually even more haram than stealing from somebody farther than a neighbor. And that is very important to keep in mind when we're talking about relatives. It starts not only a relative in blood, but also relative in place, in space, and then the relative in time, in where the person is coming at a specific time to be a guest. So relative in your own relative biologically, meaning your own self, and then place and also time. And you could see here in where the place, space, and time, you could see right here in where it starts with knowing how you share your information and others' information, whether that was a relative or others' information that was a neighbor or people that came at a specific time, in where you learn the adab in your own relations, your own blood relations, your own space, and the people that surround you, and the time when you may have specific temporary relationship between you and others. Any questions anybody wants to ask? This is the end of the hadith, and inshallah, alhamdulillah, I didn't get any pains discussing this hadith. Here's somebody that said about Muslim neighbors, what are non-Muslim neighbors' rights? So non-Muslim neighbors' rights, pretty much the same Muslim neighbors' rights, but a Muslim neighbor's rights is more simply because you have that sharaka fi din, that you share a deen, in where you're going to remind them of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You are going to have more responsibility on a Muslim than actually a non-Muslim, because there are more rights on a Muslim. So for the Muslim is even a bigger responsibility, because it becomes a family. And remember, in Islam, a family is not necessarily the blood that you share, but it is farther in where you're sharing iman. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually tells Prophet Nuh alayhi salam, when he asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to save his son, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّهُ لَيْسَ مِنْ أَهْلِكَ إِنَّهُ عَمَلٌ غَيْرُ صَالِحٍ. Told him that he's not from your family, because what he did was not pious. And إِنِّي أَعِظُكَ أَن تَكُونَ مِنَ الْجَاهِلِينَ. I warn you from being the ones from al-jahilin. So another question says, what I do about the tradition of stuffing the guest with food, but I have no food. So generally, give what you are able to give. لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not obligate you to do more than what you can handle. So but make sure, don't necessarily keep saying, well, no, you're going to eat. Some people are shy, so you would have to evaluate the circumstance and evaluate the situation. Is she shy, or does she not want to eat, or is she just not an eating person? So you would have to evaluate the situation. Here's another one. What about me visiting someone? I can't eat too much, as their tradition is to cook much for a guest? What do I do when the two traditions contradict? I mean, so in general, you want to make sure that you don't let the person feel that you're disgusted, that you are somehow thinking that they are less. You know, in the end, لا إفراط ولا تفريط. You don't want to be excessive on either end. You want to combine, and you know what you are okay with, and at the same time you're not showing disrespect to the person that's in front of you. And here's another. Allah barik fiki, Sister Fatima. Do I follow a non-Muslim neighbor's funeral? So following a non-Muslim neighbor's funeral, it's not haram to follow a funeral, but you want to make sure that you don't attend the ritual when they're actually doing it. But if they're doing, let's say, a funeral for the non-Muslim neighbor, there's absolutely nothing wrong with going to a non-Muslim funeral. But it's haram to attend when they're doing that ritual session. So the ritual, that prayer session, just, I guess, stand on the side until they finish their worship, so you won't be part of that worship, and you can actually attend that funeral. And this is it. Jazakumullah khairan, everybody. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. If anybody has anything that they would like to add, I'd be happy to unmute. All right, this is it. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.